So one of the first things that that I remember that first semester was this very intense introduction between us and the people we taught. That's a photo from the fall of 1996 teaching. That fall, one of my students named Richard wrote an essay for my writing class. The title was "Why Americans Are So Casual." and the essay said, "Our foreign language teachers, Peter and Adam, came to teach us this term. It provides a good opportunity of understanding the American way of life. In my opinion, they are more casual than us Chinese people. Why do I think so? I'll give you some facts to explain this. For example, when Mr. Hessler is having class, he can scratch himself casually without paying attention to what others may say. He dresses up casually, usually with his belt dropping and dangling. But to tell you the truth, it isn't considered a good manner in China, especially in old people's eyes. In my opinion, I think it's very natural. Last week when Ms. Thompson, another Peace Corps volunteer, gave us a lecture on the American election, she took off her woolen sweater and tied it to her waist. To us Chinese people, it's almost unimaginable. But thank goodness we majored in English and know something about America. It didn't surprise us. But if other people saw this, they might not believe their own eyes. So we were, we were not exactly prepared for the expectations, and there were a lot of mistakes were made in the first term. Our students were training, all of them were English majors, and this was a teacher's college. So part of what was going on in China at this time was a huge expansion of the educational system, sort of across all levels. So they were trying to expand universities, but they were also trying to expand middle schools, having more kids go to high school. Very few students in the past had even gone to high school. And they were trying to make English compulsory from middle school on. And in order to do that, they needed more teachers. So they had colleges like our college to train teachers. And so our students were coming and training English, and eventually they would return to become English teachers. It was very rare to go to university at that time. Only 1 out of every 12 college-age Chinese was able to enter any kind of tertiary educational institution at that time. That's only 8%. When scientists who study educational systems, they often talk about 3 stages of higher education, which is universal, mass, and elite, mass, and universal. And the elite stage is when you have fewer than 15% of people going to college. And that's the stage China was at that time. Only the top students were able to test into universities. At that time, so almost all of our students had come from the countryside, which was true for almost everybody. Our seniors, the first year we taught, most of the students had been born around 1974, and in 1974 the population was 83% rural. And so most of these young people had grown up on farms. Usually they had very little tradition of education in their families. It was very common for their parents to be illiterate. Often they had not been to school at all. And in many cases, these were the first kids from their villages to go to university. Most of them had chosen English names. There's a few of them here. This was a boy who called himself Jimmy, wearing the Bulls jersey. That was a common outfit in those days because that was the era of Michael Jordan. Kathy in the middle, and that was one of our class monitors, one of the sort of student administrators named Mo on the left there. Mo actually was not a smoker, but people often took pictures with cigarettes because that was what, like Deng Xiaoping, they always had these pictures. So he had just posed with somebody else's cigarette for that picture. And a lot of the students, as we taught, they sort of expanded some of these names. So we had a student named Willie who became William Foster, and then he became William Jefferson Foster. And we had a student named George who became George Baker Frost, and Mo became Mo Money. So they were, this was, and all of them, when they entered college, in China you have something called a hukou, which is like your registration permit. And when you entered college, your hukou immediately switched from rural to urban. They became city residents, which is kind of a big deal in China. It affects a lot of things like land ownership and all kinds of where your kids go to school. So this was a real transformation for them. And you could kind of see at the time where they were going. Like this was a picture from a Christmas party that we had when the students kind of dressed up and they were wearing their best clothes. These were a couple of the students. Young C, you can see there on the right. He had chosen his English name was just a literal translation of his Chinese pen name. and then North, who's standing next to between Adam and me there. And North was another one of the class monitors, one of these guys who kind of helped coordinate and administer the class. And he had chosen his name because North is the traditional direction of authority in China. Like Beijing, the northern capital is what Beijing means. And so he had chosen that. He also read somewhere that there was a British prime minister in history who had been named North, which is true. Frederick North, the Earl of Guildford. But I think North's book did mention that was the prime minister who lost the American colonies. So not so auspicious. But anyway, so they, so you can see them becoming city residents, but at the same time, there are lots of signs of the countryside. When a lot of students wore these kind of jackets, like you see Mo wearing there with the tailor's label that they would leave on the sleeve. They often would wear the same thing every day, because kids had very few outfits. And you actually learn, that was one of the ways that we memorized students' names, was because, like I remember Roger always had this bright blue suit jacket. It was very easy to pick out Roger. And Mo would often wear that outfit. Being a teacher, I think always there's a real physical component to it. You have this kind of contact with your students. You're in a smaller space. Especially at that time, you had about almost 50 students in a classroom. It wasn't a big classroom. So you really feel their physicality. I remember noticing the first winter, a lot of them got these sores on their hands and often behind their ears, chilblains, which is something I hadn't really seen in the United States. And people get this when they're in cold conditions, but also if nutrition's not that great. It really wasn't very cold there, but nothing was heated. And the students would wash their clothes by hand in cold water, so they would, and they didn't eat that well, so they had these sores. You could also notice in this picture, one thing that's always striking to me is how much taller I am than all of these students. Now Adam's actually tall. He's actually over 6 feet tall. I'm not. I'm like 5'9", but I would sort of tower over a lot. The students were very small because they had grown up in pretty limited circumstances. So you had this sort of sense that many of them were coming out of poverty, but we often didn't realize the degree of this until later, because students wouldn't talk about stuff. For example, many years later, 20 years after I taught a boy named David, he wrote me a long letter in which he apologized for not having been a very attentive student, which, I don't know, in America, maybe you get letters from students apologizing 20 years later, but I think probably not. And in David's letter, he wrote, for 3 years, I did not eat and sleep well. I remember in 1996, for half a year, I just had 1 meal a day. I was a sad man, but now I'm happy about my life. And I remember he was one of the kids who often sort of fell asleep in class and had his head on his desk, and I just assumed he was disengaged, but the poor kid was hungry, and was not healthy. So you learned a lot about these things later. Something else we didn't have a lot of sense of was the recent past. In 1996, we were kind of a generation removed from the Mao era. Most of our students had been born around the time, Mao died in 1976, so this first group, most of the kids were like 2 years old when Mao died. So their parents had experienced events like the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1962, when millions of people in the Chinese countryside starved to death. So their parents had experienced these things, and occasionally they were referred to in essays, but usually very indirectly and without many details. One of the few students who had grown up in the city was named Emily. She had actually chosen her name from Emily Bronte. And her father was actually a university professor, so she was one of the very few who was not from the countryside. And from that first semester, she wrote about her family. And she said, when my parents were my age, the whole country was in a great confusion. Politics went first. Intellectuals were said to have the tendency to follow capitalism, so they were assigned to basic units to accept reformation. My father was one of them. In the following 8 years after he graduated from Sichuan University, he worked in a small coal mine. This had been a common experience for educated people. They were sent to the countryside to kind of learn from the peasants, learn from the villagers. In Emily's case, actually, her father was treated pretty well there. In the coal mine, because he had this mathematics background, he helped them balance their books. And they became very impressed with him. And Emily said even years later, when they would go back to visit, the people would talk about how well her father had done in helping to administer the mine. That was not necessarily a representative experience. A lot of it, the intellectuals or the educated people who were sent to places like this didn't have good experiences. And in fact, one of Emily's cousins, that family, so it was her mother's brother, was also educated and was also sent to a remote area, but in that area he was brutalized. He became the target of various political campaigns. He was often beaten at rallies, and he ended up dying young. And the family was sort of stranded there without a father. She had a cousin named Leo, and Emily's cousin Leo also had limited educational opportunities because of his class background. He didn't go beyond, I think he did 1 year of middle school and then had to leave school. He actually was brought to our campus to work as a gardener. And so he was, even though he was very bright and in many ways had a similar background to Emily, these political campaigns could give you this very different outcome, this very different fate. She wrote once about him, I don't know much about the history of my cousin's family, because he and his brothers never talk about it. My father sometimes says something, but he's far from a good storyteller. So what I know are only some fragments. And when my father tries to start a conversation, my cousins say, it's the history, and stop at that. Never have I heard them complain about the past. So I think that attitude was pretty common. If people didn't want to remember the difficult things that had happened, these students had not grown up with a strong sense of what the recent past had been like for their parents. Their parents did not want to pass that on. So we had this, very, teaching this group of people, you did think a lot about the countryside, and we were geographically very close to the countryside. The college was across the river from the main city, across one of the rivers, the Wu River, from the main city of Fuling, and right outside our gates, this was the sort of scene that we would see. These are rice terraces, and I used to hike, and I would go for runs in the morning, and you'd see farmers working with water buffalo. And you'd also see almost every one of these places, they had a threshing platform made out of cement, and they often had, in the afternoons if you were going for a walk, you'd see the child who was there doing his or her homework on that threshing platform. It was always impressive. It made me think about my place in this education system. I was training these people who would come from the countryside, and they were going to go back to rural areas and become teachers and teach people like this, these kids that you could see on those threshing platforms. The city of Fuling was very small by Chinese standards, 185,000 people in 1996. It sounds big sometimes in the United States, but not by Chinese standards. It was on the Yangtze River, so the main city was here, and the Yangtze came in from the west, and then there's another river called the Wu River coming in from the south. One thing, when I look back at these old pictures, they're incredibly, the pollution is really intense. You don't get a lot of clear skies, and that was a big part of life at that time. People burned coal for power, and there were very few pollution controls on the factories that were in the city. I had major respiratory problems the whole time I was there. Another thing that that sort of defined this experience was a sense of isolation. A place like Fuling was not very well connected to the rest of China. The nearest big city was Chongqing. There was no railroad, there was no highway going there. If you wanted to go to Chongqing or any other place of significance, you took a boat. And that boat was 8 hours going upstream to Chongqing. It took a lot of effort to go anywhere. Another picture. So this is looking down on the main part of Fuling from the north bank over the Yangtze River. One thing you kind of notice is you can see these sort of light, there's some new construction there. So even in 1997, in the winter, there were signs of development. The economic changes were starting to happen, but it was pretty early in the stages.
Make sure you're speaking to them.
Yeah. And then if you look in the, you notice the white is up there, and then here there's like a band of dark where you don't see new construction. And the reason for that was that downstream from us they were building the Three Gorges Dam, which was the largest dam in the history of the world, and it was going to raise the water level to about this level, basically. And so nobody was doing any new construction down there near the banks. And that's the first stage of that project was scheduled to be finished in 2003. So it really was not that far in the future. And you would see signs around town. When you walk through parts of the lower city, you periodically would see one of these signs, and that's the water level of the future river. And you always, every time I see one of these, I just think about, well, what's it going to be like when the water gets there? I guess that kid's head is a little bit above the water line. But You know, but it was interesting. People rarely talked about it. In the same way that they didn't talk much about the past, the recent past, they also didn't talk that much about the future. People were very much focused on what was happening now. And that was because life was pretty demanding. It was in flux. And you would have these major changes, like the first class of seniors that we taught, all of their jobs were assigned by the government. The second group that we taught our second year, they started to have more choice in their jobs, and they had to search for jobs. And this was a new thing. That last year, right shortly before we left, the college began to privatize all the housing for teachers, which had never been the case in the past. Just teachers had to buy, they were given discounted prices on their apartments, and then they owned them. And these changes were happening all across the country. So people were, you know, they had their hands full, and they weren't really, something like 2003 seemed a long time away for them. So the water was going to rise about 150 feet down by the river. This picture was taken in the winter. The water level would drop every winter. In the summer it would rise with the snow melt from the Himalayas and other mountains to the west. You kind of see here in the water there's this band of sandstone. And that would appear only in the winter when the water drops. And that was called the White Crane Ridge, the Baikoliang. And at some point, 1,300 years ago or so, somebody had carved 2 stone fish in the side of this ridge. And boatsmen began to use these as a river gauge. So if you were going downstream in the old days, you could stop there in the winter, and you could look and see where the water level was in relation to these fish. They were, you know, a marker, and that would help you understand the rapids downstream. The winter was the most dangerous time in the Three Gorges, and so the boatsmen used this, and they began to make inscriptions of their own. And often they would say that, you know, the water appeared on this day, and they would carve it in stone there. The first dated inscription was from 763 AD. But over time, they began to do, you know, long inscriptions in poetry and calligraphy, and more than 300,000 characters had been inscribed on this rock, from pretty much every dynasty in China. So it was this amazing historical relic. Very few people went there. If you went there, there was this guy from the local antiquities bureau named Wang Dejian. He used to wear like usually he was wearing a military surplus coat, and he'd be out there all winter sitting up at a little desk. In my book, I said there's like a student who's been sent out in the hallway, you know, and the wind, of course, rushes through there. It's cold. He's got water on all sides, but he knew everything about the ridge. If you stopped there and talked to him about it, he would show you the different characters that had been inscribed by various people. To get out there was a fishing family that usually docked their boat there for the winter, and you would pay them something like 20, I think it was like 25, the equivalent of 25 cents to go out. So I always liked going out there. There was this amazing sense of continuity, even if we didn't have much sense of the recent past, the distant past in some ways, you felt this. Like this picture was taken January 30th, 1998, and on that day, the river was 2 inches higher than it had been in 763 when they put the inscription there. So you had the sense of time and also the cycles of the river. You know, the river every year making this, you know, dropping and rising and the ridge appearing. Of course, that cycle was going to be broken. Once the water went up 150 feet, 200 feet, the ridge would no longer appear every winter. You know, by my second year, I was, you know, Adam and I were studying Chinese there throughout. Second year, I started using newspaper articles, and anything about the local antiquities I would try to clip and study with my tutor. And on January 1st of my last year, 1998, in the Chongqing Wanbao, the Chongqing Evening News, there was an article about it called the White Crane Ridge Inscriptions Protection Plan to be determined, and they talked about 2 possible plans. One plan was to build an underwater museum. The other proposal was to make rubbings of all the carvings and put them into some kind of gallery. And I remember when I did this with my tutor in class, he said they're not going to build a museum. They always make these promises that they can't deliver. And you know, Fuling, of course, this was a town that didn't have even a stoplight, not to mention no highway, no railroad. And you know, I wrote about this in my first book in Rivertown. I wrote sort of saying that they would probably do the rubbings. To them, this would undoubtedly be the more practical solution. The region didn't have the sort of resources necessary to build an underwater exhibition chamber. And experts estimated that within 10 years of the dam's completion, the the silt and sand of the new reservoir would erase all 12 centuries worth of carvings. So we finished in the summer of 1998, and as I was, as Adam and I were getting near the end of our time there, we realized that we really wanted to stay in touch with these young people, and so we collected all of their addresses. In those days, people didn't have access to the internet, they didn't have cell phones, and it was hard to stay in touch. But I collected all these addresses, and I was fortunate in that about less than a year after I left, I returned to Beijing to become a journalist. And so when I was based in Beijing, it was much easier to communicate. Because in those days, to write a letter to the United States, the postage was about $50, and most of my students made about $30 a month as teachers. That was generally their salary when they were starting out. But the postage for within China was not expensive. So when I was in Beijing, every semester I would write out a letter and send it to all of my former students. And I had this, first I did the addresses by hand, and then I would photocopy them, and I would get these letters, which I still have. There's hundreds and hundreds of these letters from people writing. And in some ways we were in a similar situation. I was starting a new life as a journalist. They were starting new lives as teachers. All of us were a little lonely, and we had some time on our hands, and we were right back and forth. And I would hear from them. One of the first series of letters I would get, the first couple of years, was often about their dating and their marriage. Most of them, as rural people, it was a tradition to marry pretty young, and most of them did. So the first couple of years, I would get reports from them. One student wrote in December 20th, 2000, last winter, I was married with a doctor. He is not very handsome, but he is very kind to me. Next spring, we will have a baby. November 15th, 2004. What makes me happy is that I married an ugly woman who graduated from the math department of Fuling. Another student wrote on April 22nd of 2000. After graduating Fuling Teachers College, my parents and relatives all wanted to introduce girlfriends to me. Some were also very beautiful, but when they saw me, they at once went away and left a word. The toad wants to eat the meat of the swan. Now I find a girlfriend finally. She will be my wife after 2000. She isn't beautiful. There are many black points on her face. But I love her because she has more money than me. Maybe I love her money more. I have many things to say, but I can't write out. This letter is typed for my girlfriend's the letters were often, sort of, this was something Adam and I used to joke about, because sometimes if a student would show us a picture of his girlfriend, would say, oh yeah, she's very beautiful. No, she's very ugly. It's just like an automatic. And this is kind of a rural Chinese, it's a type of modesty, basically. It's like you shouldn't take too much pleasure in something good. It's almost a little bit like, when we lived in Egypt, they had something called the evil eye, the Ayn Hasud, which is that you don't want to bring negative attention on you by sort of taking pleasure in the things you have that are good. And so there was this reflexive rural thing about, yeah, no, she's very ugly. My kid's dumb, they were always called like this. But you did get this sense pretty early of their lives improving. They're suddenly he's typing on a computer. They started to talk, we have a highway in our town now. You should come visit, it's easier. Rail lines were being built. Pretty soon they were having cell phones. And as this communication continued, I would often go down and visit students and just sort of see how they were doing periodically in addition to the letters. And after about 10 or more years, I also started to do surveys with them. Because we had this nice communication going. After my first book was published, they all read that. They would read the stories that I wrote. So they were very aware of what I did as a writer. And we had there was like a level of honesty and trust that was unusual. And so I would send them surveys and ask them questions about their lives, including some of the financial details. So and I noticed when they started, they were usually making about, as they said, $30 a month was somewhere like about $500 a year. By the time I surveyed them in 2014, their median household income was nearly $18,000, and it almost doubled in the next 7 years to $35,000, and it's gone up significantly since then. So you could really see their lives improving quickly, and of course they also began to look like urban middle-class people. This is one of the reunions when Adam and I went back to Fuling, and the students look very, very different than they did in the old days. This is all money there, I should say. And most overwhelmingly they continue teaching. More than 90% of them are still teaching, which also was very striking. I mean, in America, if you had a group of teacher trainees in 1996, you would not have 90% of them still teaching today, I think. But this sort of reflected the fact that their salaries had gone up at a good rate, and they were also respected, and the job was considered good. They were happy to do that. you know, I often thought of, I sort of described them in this book as the reform generation because they grew up with the reforms that Deng Xiaoping had started in 1978. They didn't have any advantages in terms of their birth or really the places they were from, but they had great timing. They were really a fortunate group of people because this was when the country was really changing. And it's sort of amazing what some of these, how some of these people's lives were transformed. I told you earlier about Youngsi and North. Youngsi became a teacher in the small village near his hometown, you know, making $30 a month. He decided to supplement his income by setting up a private training course. The students were starting to hear about computers, so he was going to teach them how to type. So he bought 2 little cheap keyboards, and he would have the students come, and they would line up behind these 2 keyboards in a line of like 20 students behind each keyboard, and then he had an alarm, and they'd go for 2 minutes, the kid would get to practice typing, and then the alarm would sound, and the next student would take his place. And he charged, I think he charged like 2 kwai, which was something like around a quarter for the course. But this was significant money in those days, and a lot of the kids' parents were saying, yeah, they should learn about computers, and they were signing up for the course. And the school he was teaching didn't know what to do about this, and initially they had meetings, and they said, no, you can't do this, this is a public school, you can't have your evening class here. But then somebody else said, well, isn't this what Deng Xiaoping told us to do? Like, we're supposed to be starting business, and so they said, okay, well, you can do it. So he did this, and he saved some money. He ended up transferring to a different job in Fuling, and then he got some, like about $1,000 from an investor, took his own money, and he started a cell phone shop. This was when people were starting to be able to buy phones around 1998, 99. And as part of his stock, he also had walkie-talkies. One of the phone companies had given him some walkie-talkies, and he didn't think this was something most people would buy, but he began to realize very quickly that those actually sold very well. And then he figured out the reason was because if you were on a construction site at that time, most workers don't have cell phones in 1999. They used walkie-talkies. And if you expand your construction crew, you can buy more walkie-talkies. You go back to the same place. And so he realized this was actually a huge market, and nobody else had quite figured this out. And he was really the first in that city of Fuling to do that. He ended up opening another shop. He expanded into other communities. And then that one thing led to another, which is often the case with business in China in this era. So then he started to do things related to construction. He started a construction company. He would buy real estate. He did parking, lot management systems, all kinds of things related to the new development. And when I visited him in 2021, when we went back to the Fuling campus, he came in from Chongqing. He was driving a Mercedes S350. So he means that the car is more than $150,000. And then this was a kid who had grown up in rural poverty. And so they often, because it wasn't like they had great connections or anything special, but they would find these niches. North, this is the one who was the class monitor. The niche that he figured out was that they had built all of these buildings very quickly in Fuling around the time of the Three Gorges to resettle people, and they usually didn't put elevators in them. And the construction often wasn't that good, and they just were in a rush, and people in those days were willing to go up steps, and even 12-story buildings wouldn't have elevators. So he figured out a business where he would go and attach elevators to these buildings. He said, people in China are getting older, my generation's getting older, they're not going to want to walk up 8 floors of steps. And he had no engineering background. He had an engineer who did the technical stuff, but it was a very, he had been a political, the banjiang, or the class monitor, as a student. And this was also a political job, because if you put an elevator in a Chinese building, you have to negotiate with every resident. And every floor pays a different amount. It has to be like at that level of specificity. People are so competitive and so intense about negotiation. So you charge more for the 3rd floor than you do for the 2nd floor. And he has to figure out this fee structure. And he had a very good personality for that. And you get a key that goes only to your floor. So he had all these systems set up. So, so you see them sort of finding these niches. So when I went back to teach, in 2019 at Sichuan University. And partly because I wanted to reconnect with these students I had taught. I also was interested in teaching young people today to see what they were like. Actually, some things hadn't changed. Like some people I think were laughing who read Chinese and probably see that, because my Chinese name is Huawei, and they have this poster that says Wei Ge, which is, it kind of means like Big Brother Wei, but it also means Viagra. It's funny because they were making those Viagra jokes in the 1990s, and they're still making them now. These students, it seems to be a universal thing in Sichuan college. So again, back when we first taught, 8% of college-age Chinese entered college. In 2019, when I went there, that figure had risen to 51.6%. So that actually meant that China had passed from elite education to mass and then all the way to universal. So all 3 stages of educational development in the span of 1 generation. And in order to do that, you have to obviously build new campuses. And so Fuling, for example, the enrollment was about 2,000 students total when we taught there in 1998 when we left. 6 years later, that expanded to 20,000. This is incredible, on a scale of tenfold to do that. They did that all across China. Almost all of the places where Peace Corps volunteers taught had that kind of increase. That first semester that I taught in Sichuan University, I didn't have 1 student from the countryside. The next semester, I think I had 1 or 2, but almost all of these kids were urban kids. China had become majority urban in 2011, and now most of these young people were growing up in the cities. Most of them were only children. In the old days, most of the kids from the countryside had come from families, often with 3 or 4 kids, and more than 90% of my students at Sichuan University had no siblings. But the change that probably struck me the most, I would show them that picture of me with the students and show them how tall I was, and they would laugh because now a lot of these students were taller than me. When I did some research on it, there was a study that appeared in 2020 in the Lancet that out of 200 countries, China had seen the largest increase in boys' height and the 3rd largest in girls' height since 1985. And the average Chinese 19-year-old male was now more than 3.5 inches taller. So you really would feel this sort of, we talk about 800 million people were lifted out of poverty, lifted themselves out of poverty since the reform era. And that number is so huge that it's there's no context for it really. But when you are in the classroom and you see this at the physical level, you really understand what it means. People have been transformed in kind of every way. These are pictures of my Fuling students with their kids who were kind of the same age as my Sichuan University students. And actually one of my Fuling students had a son who was at Sichuan University when I was teaching there. But you notice that these boys are kind of tower over their mothers. And that's generally the case because of the improved nutrition. Another thing that was really different was the relationship with the past. That earlier group people didn't talk about. Their parents hadn't told them stories. That wasn't true anymore. This was one of the boys who was taller than me, born in Fenton, whose parents were about the same age as my Fuling students. And he wrote a very nice essay about listening to his parents. Before I left home and went to college, I had such an interest in listening to my parents' stories about their childhood. When my dad was my age, he worked as a taxi driver. My mother was a woman worker in a state-owned flour factory. I was born in the crossroad of 2 centuries. Taking advantage of the rapid development of market economy in the coming century, they decided to devote themselves to industry. They described how they had started a factory that made plastic shopping bags, and they had done well with this. And he talked about how they always told stories, and they'd say, when we were young, things were very difficult. And then we were able to do this, and it tells how they achieved it. And then he said the ending of the story would always be, and this is why you should appreciate what you have. And he said he described them as kind of like superhero films, like it was like a genre of story. And it was interesting to me because that previous generation, their parents had experienced political events in which they had no control, and they think terrible things had happened. They didn't want to talk about it. These kids' parents had experienced economic changes, educational changes. But they made them feel as if they had agency. They felt like their decisions mattered. So for somebody like Youngsi, who made this decision to open a cell phone shop, he could see what the result of that. It was a very different relationship to the past than the previous generation had been. So while I was there, I was living in Chengdu, teaching at Sichuan University, I would often go back to Fuling, and I would try to go back to the same spots and take pictures to kind of compare the landscapes and the city. I mean, one of the things that really is noticeable was, of course, the air. Air is much better now, better pollution controls in the pictures now. You can see the horizon, which you really couldn't in the old days. The rivers have expanded as, Fuling was far enough from the dam that it wasn't like the whole city was flooded, but just the lower parts. One thing that I really noticed, all of these kind of fields, when you look at the pictures, are often now gone. And you saw earlier that image of the rice terrace behind. I kept trying to go back and retake pictures of the places where I hiked, and actually I could almost never identify the site because the landscape had changed so dramatically. Nobody farms rice there anymore. It's too labor intensive. And much of the land is left fallow, which is really an amazing thing. When we lived there in the 90s, China was the most populous agricultural country on earth. It became a net importer of agricultural products in 2004, and now it's the world's largest importer of food. Very few people farming. All those kids I used to see on the threshing platforms that were studying, they kept studying, they didn't go and become farmers. They became factory workers, they became entrepreneurs, they left the countryside. Going back to, this was a picture with the White Crane Ridge. So of course, the river you can see has widened dramatically, lots of high-rises in the town. When you go, they built this sort of dike, so they cleared off all this lower part of the town, and then they built a big dike there. You walk along the dike, and they have these historical displays, which are like, these are parts of the dock works from when I lived there before, 1990s, and they're sort of presented like historical artifacts, with inscriptions telling what they were used for. And in one part of that dike, they have a museum that was built. I went there with my, I've been there a number of times. You go in and you go down this huge escalator that's like 300 feet long, and you get down to the bottom, and you're in this chamber, and you look out this porthole, and you're looking out below the river, at the river bottom, at the White Crane Ridge. And you can see, it's hard to see from these pictures, but these inscriptions, you can see the inscriptions. And you go there, and I can remember these places that I used to walk on, that I used to touch, and now it's 300 feet, 200 feet below the level of the river, which was amazing, because of course it seemed like, when I read that proposal in the paper, that it was a pipe dream. It seemed impossible. But they ended up building this museum, $34 million, it opened in 2010. And when I went there with Adam one time, that guy, Huang Dejian, who used to sit on the thing, he's the director of the museum. Right? So he's still there. Which is one of the funny things about it. There's this incredible change, but there is like this strong continuity. And it seems amazing. This guy, he used to be there in this like PLA jacket and shivering on the rock. And now when I went there, he has like 2 cell phones, and he's a big dignitary. He has pictures of him with all the leaders who come, and he just like takes it all in stride. This is what happened, right? I used to sit out there on the river, and now I'm on this $34 million museum that I run. So that's part of the challenge of understanding China is these things that change and things that stay the same. And part of that is also that we have this educational improvement, this economic improvement, but the politics are basically the same as they were. It's still a one-party state. In some ways, it's more oppressive now, actually, than it was when I taught. And that's a very difficult thing, I think, as an outsider to think about. I noticed, when we taught there in the 90s, the students were very patriotic, and they would talk about Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping and people like that all the time. Jiang Zemin, who was the leader. In 1996, I asked them to write about their heroes, and of 22 who wrote about public figures, 15 chose political leaders. Most of them Mao Zedong, but also a significant number for Deng and for Zhou Enlai. Nobody chose a scientist or an entrepreneur. And when I went back to teach in 2019 and 2020, one thing that really struck me is they didn't bring up political leaders. They didn't refer to Mao much. They didn't refer to Deng much. I actually couldn't remember in 4 semesters anybody mentioning Xi Jinping's name in class. Not once. And I got curious about this. I went back through and I looked at papers. I reviewed more than 500 papers that I'd received from students during those 2 years of teaching. And, Xi Jinping was mentioned only 22 times, and generally in passing. And when I asked them that same question, who are your heroes, the most popular choices by far were scientists and entrepreneurs. And of 65 students who answered, only 9 wrote about Chinese political leaders. 4 of them said Mao, 3 said Deng, 1 said Zhou Enlai, and only 1 student said Xi Jinping, which meant that she was tied with Eminem, Jim Morrison, Lionel Messi, and George Washington. And the student who chose Washington wrote, the reason why I admire him most is that he gave up his political power voluntarily. And so things were often communicated indirectly. I found them to be quite sophisticated in their thinking. They were much savvier about how things worked. And for the most part, they would kind of disengage from politics. We have this idea that young people in China are politically indoctrinated, which is true. And we have this idea they become little pink xiaofenhong, kind of very patriotic. I didn't find that to be my experience as much. I thought that dynamic was not as strong as we sometimes think. And actually, most of my students were kind of disengaged from politics, which, from the party's point of view, is probably not the worst outcome, right? That people don't. When I asked them recently, when I did a survey, I do the same kind of surveys with the students I taught at Central University, and I said, what do you worry about the most? And it was interesting, out of 47, only one person said environmental issues. I think would be a big number in the United States. Only 3 mentioned politics of any sort, and only 3 specified possibility of war with Taiwan. Almost all of the things that when they answered this were personal things. I'm worried about graduate school, I'm worried about my job. I think this is what you learn is you have, what can you control? Again, it's that issue of agency. What's the point in worrying about these things that I can't fix? I think that's sort of the mindset. So looking back at these sort of 2 generations, in the 90s, of course, they were coming out of poverty, but you could see the path, the goals were pretty clear. They wanted to get better educated, you wanted to move to the city, you wanted to improve your material standards, and you could do all of those things at that time. I think now for young people in China, the future is murkier. The goals are harder to identify. Most of them already have a fairly comfortable material standard. What is it that they value? What do they want to do in the future? I think this, in some ways, the challenge is higher to them. The challenge is greater. One of the questions that I asked, do you want to have children eventually? And most of the students said no. And especially for women. Of the 25 women who responded to the survey, 76% did not want children. One of them wrote, we are already a confused generation, and children's upbringing requires long periods of companionship and observation and guidance, which is difficult to ensure in the face of intense social pressure. The future of Chinese society is an adventure, and children do not demand to be born. I am worried that my children are not warriors and are lost in it. So these are sort of, I think we're at a different stage of challenge, a different stage of what young people face. So I'd like to stop here, open it up to questions. I think if anybody, if you can ask a question in the mic, that's ideal. Yeah, any questions? Yeah, Adam?
Yeah. I'm not following you around, just here for the fact checking. For those of you who have read Rivertown, I just want to point out that Mo Money was one of the students who took the Spanish class I taught the second year, and he portrayed Don Quixote in the scene in which they acted out Don Quixote with Chinese characteristics to connect him. When we were there in 2016, one of the big changes, one of the big things that struck me walking around Fuling was how invisible I was. Nobody looked at me, nobody yelled "La Wai" or "Hello," which had happened constantly in 1996. I just feel like the big change of having a more cosmopolitan community and more international exposure. Wondering if you have any comments about other changes you saw when you went back to Chengdu in 2019 to 2021, also in terms of students studying overseas.
Yeah, no, that's true. That people didn't notice foreigners in the same way. I mean, we were so unusual in the 90s. A lot of people have been to China since then, and huge numbers of young people have been overseas. That's probably a big part of it too. More than half of the passports in China are people, millennials or younger. That's the generation that is traveling, that is going abroad. So these connections are very different. The Fuling College actually has a lot of African students who are there on scholarships from the Chinese government who are studying there. And that's something that we never would have imagined that the college would be able to bring in foreigners to study there. It was amazing enough just to have 2 teachers from America. That's when they would take their math book and they put it in the Pinda book, and they would do their math homework to try to get ahead. And then because they saw their classmates doing this, like very early, they're learning this. Don't engage, ignore it. It's not serious. It's not part of what's important for your life. And so these lessons do become internalized, and it's rationality, right? I mean, if you fight the state, it can be very brutal. I think for most Chinese, they don't have these awful encounters with authority, but if they push in certain ways, they will, and they know that, and so they avoid it. They also, these kids feel a lot of pressure. When you're an only child, and all of your family, the investment in education is intense. I mean, all these supplementary classes that kids take, and so much of the disposable income will go who are trying to support a child's education, sending them to the United States to study, and you feel that pressure as a kid. You know, are you going to take this opportunity and then fight the state? Take that risk, right? And sometimes if you do that, I've had students here who have made comments on social media and somebody calls their parents, you know, and gives them a veiled threat. And we notice your son's doing this on social media. You shouldn't do that. You know, they want to identify themselves, they want to say it, but they know what it means.
I have a